Sidney's An Apology for Poetry. Let us understand what Sidney is trying to say in Apology for Poetry. First of all, we have to understand the time period of Philip Sidney. The time period is approximately, this time was 1580, which is, you can, if you want to remember it historically, that it was a Mughal period in India. So 1580, 1595. This is a time period which is very early. And let me start it. What is there in Apology for Poetry? An Apology for Poetry, or the Defense of Poetry, is a work of literary criticism by Elizabethan poet Philip Sidney. It was written in approximately 1580 and first published in 1595 after his death. It is generally believed that he was at least partly motivated by Stephen Gosson, a former playwright who dedicated his attack on the English stage, the School of Abuse, to Sidney in 1579. I repeat, it is generally believed that he was at least partly motivated by Stephen Gosson, Gosson, a former playwright who dedicated his attack on English stage, the School of Abuse, to Sidney in 1579. But Sidney primarily addressed more general objections to poetry, such as those of Plato. In his essay, Sidney integrates a number of classical and Italian percepts on fiction. The essence of his defense is that poetry, by combining the liveliness of history with the ethical focus of philosophy, is more effective than either history or philosophy in rousing its reader to virtue. The work also offers important comments on Edmund Spenser and Elizabethan stage. Sidney states that there have been three general kinds of poetry. Remember these three kinds of poetry. Just to simplify, the first is imitation, which is primarily a religious imitation. The second is inconceivable excellence of God. That is what. The second is philosophical, and the third is imaginative poetry. So, imaginative poetry is generally for teaching purpose, which teaches, delight the human spirit. What are the influences of Philip Sidney? We can understand. You listen this audio carefully. It will help you a lot in writing your answer. Philip Sidney's influence can be seen throughout the subsequent history of English literary criticism. One of the most important examples is the work of poet and critic P.B. Shelley. Shelley's modern argument for poetry is cast in a romantic strain in his critical work, A Defense of Poetry, in 1858. William Stigate, a Cambridge educated translator, poet and essayist, writes in his essay, Sir Philip Sidney, that Shelley's beautifully written Defense of Poetry is work which analyzes the very inner essence of poetry and the reason of its existence, its development, form, operation, and the mind of man. Shelley writes in defense that while ethical is science, arrange the elements which poetry has created and leads to the moral civil life. Poetry acts in a way that awakens enlarges and mind itself by rendering its receptacle of the thousands unapprehended combinations of the thoughts. Sidney's influence on future critique and poets relates more closely to his view of the place of poet in society. Sidney describes poetry as creating a separate reality. The romantic notion, as seen in Wordsworth, is that poetry privileges perception, imagination, and modes of understanding. Wordsworth seeks to go back to nature for a moment, recollection in tranquility. Shelley, Wordsworth sees the poet as being separate from society. To Sidney, the poet is not tied to any subjection. He saw art as equivalent to skill, a profession to be learned and developed. And nature is objective empirical world. The poet can invent and thus in reflect grows another nature. Sidney writes that there is no art delivered to mankind that hath not the work of nature for his principal object. The poet that does not depart from external nature, his work are imitation or fiction, made of the materials of nature and are shaped by the artist's vision. This vision is one that demands the reader's awareness of the art of imitation created through the maker, the poet. Sidney's notion of foreconceit means that conception of the work must exist in the poet's mind before it's written, free from imitation of the limitations of the nature and independent from nature. Poetry is capable of making things either better than nature bring forth or quite a new form such as has never been in the nature. Sidney's doctrine presents the poet as creator, the poet mediating role between two worlds, transcendence form and historical actuality. Corresponds to the Neoplatonic doctrine of emanation. A completion to this doctrine is the concept of return or catharsis, which finds a parallel in Sidney's contemplation of virtue based on men's rational desire. Apology constrains only elements of Neo-Platonism without adhering to the full doctrine. Thirdly, Sidney implies the theory of metaphoric language in his work. A recurring motif in apology is painting or portraiture. Apology applies language use in a way suggestive of what is known in modern literary theory as semiotics. His central promise was that of Socrates in Plato's Republic, is that poetry is an art of imitation, and it representing a counterfeiting or figuring forth, not unlike speaking picture. Sidney places homage to Aristotle also, and he develops his own idea of metaphoric language, one that is based on an analogy through universal correspondence. Sidney's humanist poetic and his tendency to harmonize disparate extremes to seek mediation find expression in poetic work by John Donne. The life and writing of Sir Philip Sidney remains a legacy. In 1819, Thomas Campbell concluded that Sidney's life was poetry in action, and then in 1858, William Stignant wrote that Sidney's real poem was his life and his teaching was his example. Sidney the man is apparent everywhere in his work. A study of Sidney's work is a study of the man. These quotations are significant for your answer, and therefore I repeat again. The life and writing of Sir Philip Sidney remain legacy. In 1819, Thomas Campbell. There are two writers who are making statement about Sir Philip Sidney. Remember the names: Thomas Campbell and William Stigart. Thomas Campbell concludes that Sidney's life was poetry in action, and then in 1858, William Stigart wrote Sidney's real poem was his life and his teaching was his example. Sidney, the man, is apparent everywhere in his work. A study of Sidney's work is a study of the man. What are the significant things about apology for poetry? Is one of the most important contribution to literary theory written in English during the Renaissance. Sidney advocates a place for poetry within the framework of aristocratic state. While showing concern for both literary and national identity, Sidney responds in apology to an emerging antipathy to poetry and expressed in Stephen Gosson's The School of Abuse. Gosson offers what is essence an attack on imaginative literature. What is at stake is Sidney's argument is defense of poetry's nobility. The significance of the nobility of poetry is its power to move readers to virtuous action. True poet must teach the delight, a view that dates back to Horace. In an era of antipathy to the poetry and puritanical belief in the corruption endangered by literature, Sidney's defense was a significant contribution to the genre of literary criticism. It was England's first philosophical defense in which he describes poetry's ancient and indispensable place in the society, its mimetic nature and ethical function. Among Sidney's gift to his contemporaries were his respect for tradition and willingness to experiment. An example of the latter is approach to Plato. He reconfigures Plato's argument against poets by saying that poets are the least liar. Poets never claim to know the truth, nor make circle around your imagination, nor rely on authority. As an expression of a cultural attitude descending for Aristotle, Sidney, when starting that the poet never affirmed, make the claim that all statements in literature are hypothetical or pseudo statements. Sidney, as a traditionalist, however, gives attention to drama in contradiction to poetry. drama, writes Sidney, is observing neither rules of honesty, civility, nor of skillful poetry, thus cannot do justice to this genre. In Sidney's days, theatricality and aesthetic and ideological concern flourishing among Sidney's circle at court. Theatre became a contentious issue in the part because of the culmination of growing contempt for the value of the emergent consumer culture and expanding money economy encouraged social mobility. Europe at this time had its first encounter with inflation. London's theatres at that time grew in popularity so much that by 1605, despite the introduction of the charges, London commercial theatres could accommodate up to 8,000 men and women. Sidney had his own view on drama. In Apology, he shows opposition to current of his day that pay little attention to unity of the place in drama, but more specifically, his concern is with the manner that matter is conveyed. He explained that tragedy is not bound to history or narrative but to laws of poesy, having liberty either to feign a quite new matter or frame the history of the most tragical conveniency. Sidney employs a number of strategies to assert the proper place of poetry. For instance, he argues against the way in which poetry was misaligned with youth, the effeminate and the timorous. He does so by introducing the idea that poetry is the companion of camps and by invoking the heroes of ages past. Sidney's reverence for the poet as a soldier is significant because he himself was soldier at one time. Poetry and apology become an art that requires the noble stirring of the courage. Sidney writes an apology for poetry in the form of judicial oration for defense, and thus it like a trial in the structure. Crucial in his defense is the descriptive discourage and the idea that poetry creates a separate reality. Sidney employs forensic method, a rhetoric as a tool to make argument that poetry is not only conveys a separate reality but that it has long and venerable history. It does not lie. It is defensible and on right and means to move readers to virtuous action. What are the methods which Sidney is using? Censorship is one issue Sidney had to overcome through his use of rhetorical device of apology. Sidney was also versed in the phenomena of courtship. As a part of his strategy against the theatre of censorship, Sidney uses the structure of classical oration with its conventional division such as exordium and perorato. Sidney's use of classical oration stems from his humanist education. He uses this method to build his argument by making use of the rhetorical method of such a guide as Thomas Wilson. Art of Rhetoric, 1553, Harvey. Sidney also uses metaphor and allegory to conceal and reveal his position. For instance, his use of horsemanship and imagery and analogy substantiate his vision of transformation power of poetry. Sidney as author enters his work undetected that the etymology of his name Philip in horse lovers. From the opening discourse on the horsemanship, Sidney expands on the horses and saddles metaphor throughout his work by enlarging of conceit. It is Sidney who then guard against the falling out with the poet whiffers. Sidney also attends to the rhetorical concept of memory, poetry apart from its ability to delight and affinity with memory. Methods and styles thus are the key concept of components of apology to overcome the problem of the censorship. For this reason, Sidney consciously defends fiction and he attacks the privilege that is accorded to facts. He argues that the poet makes no literal claim of truth, is under no illusion, and thus creates statements that are in sense fictional and true as any other. What is at stake then is not only a value of the poetry in the sense its utility, and is also place in the world replete with strife, contingent and provisional. So there are significant things which we need to understand about Sidney's An Apology for Poetry, and these are again what he's giving. These are the things which are very significant. He says that defense of poetry, where he says he's trying to give it a natural look to the outcome of human imagination, and that's how he's defending poetry. It is not as spontaneous, it is well crafted and it is well understood and thought before it is written. So Sidney writes, there is no art delivered to mankind that hath not the work of nature of his principal object. The poet then does not depart from external nature. His works are imitation or fiction made of the material of nature and are shaped by the artist's vision. This vision is one that demands the reader's awareness of the art of imitation created through maker, the poet. Sidney's notion of foreconceit means that the conception of the work must exist in the poet's mind before it is written. So that's how it's a well crafted, well thought and well written idea, which is what the poetry is there. Poetry is capable of making things either better than nature bring forth, quite a new form such as never in the nature. Like the way Wordsworth says that poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling. Contrary to that, Sidney says that the foreconceit means that the conception of the work must exist in the mind of the writer, free from limitation of nature and independent from the nature. Poetry is capable of making things either better than the nature bring forth, and quite a new form such as never in the nature. So these are the basic things which we need to understand. And then he says, Sidney's doctrine presents the poet as a creator. Okay, the poet's mediating role between the two worlds, transcendent form and historical actuality, corresponds to the Neo-Platonic doctrine of emanation. A complement to this doctrine is the concept of return or catharsis, which finds a parallel in Sidney's contemplation of virtue based on men's rational desire. Apology contains only elements of Neoplatonism without adhering to the full doctrine. Thirdly, Sidney implies the theory of metaphoric language in his work. A recurring motif in Apology is painting of the portraiture. Apology applies language used in a way suggestive, what is known in the modern literary theory as semiotic. So, a language is suggested, a poet already is having a well crafted thought in his mind, and then it is actually making things better than the nature. What the nature is presenting, a poet is capable of making them better. So it's not spontaneous overflow, but it's a well crafted art which a poet is expertise of that. So an apology of poetry is one of the most important contributions to the literary theory written in English during the Renaissance. Sidney advocates a place for the poetry within the framework of an aristocratic state while showing concern for both literary and national identity. Sidney responds in Apology to an emerging antipathy in poetry and expression in Stephen Gosson's The School of Abuse. Gosson's offer what is essence and attack of imaginative literature. What is in the stake? Sidney's argument is his defense of poetry's nobility. The significance of the nobility is poetry's power to move reader to virtuous action. True poet must teach and delight. That's what the and these are the a way that dates back to Horace. In an era of antipathy to poetry and puritanical belief in the corruption endangered by literature, Sidney's defense was a significant contribution to the genre of literary criticism. It was England's first philosophical defense in which he described poetry's ancient and indispensable place in the society. Its mimetic nature, ethical fiction, and it is how the gift to the contemporaries were his response to tradition and willingness to experiment. An example of the latter is approach to Plato. He reconfigures Plato's argument against poets by saying that poets are least liar. Poets never claim. So his ideas are against Plato, because Plato doesn't appreciate poetry. And that's how these are the main significant ideas we need to understand about defense of poetry.